Sanbonani, Dumelang, that's all I can manage. And welcome to the very first African Feminisms Colloquium at Rhodes University. For those of you who arrived yesterday, we're really glad that you survived the cold. It's not an easy task, but keep doing whatever you're doing because it's right. I'd just like to extend a welcome to those, to all of you obviously, and to those, especially those who've travelled from very, very far. We've got Lizzle Bishop from Glasgow and various other people from all over the place. And we'd especially also like to welcome our invited guests, Professor Nilika Jayawardene, Professor Betty Govenden, Dr. Yvette Abrams, Professor Pumla Dineo-Ola, and Dr. Danai Muptosa. This is a truly exciting initiative, which is spearheaded by Dr. Shalene Khan, Dr. Linda Spencer, and myself. And we are very grateful to our funders, the Mellon Foundation, the National Research Foundation, Art on Our Mind, UCAPI, and Rhodes University. Just a few notes about the colloquium. We are eco-friendly, or we try to be as eco-friendly as possible and accessible to all, so everyone is welcome. And we try to accommodate anyone who has any special requirements. Okay, so also on our program we have an error, and the first person who spots what that error is wins a prize. So if you do spot the error, please let it be known to Charlene or Linda or myself, and basically we'll just have to keep time to find out who got it first, because we're not going to be together all the time. Okay, so if you're live tweeting this event, the hashtag is hashtag Afems 17. We're also on Facebook. And if you're visiting us and are trying to get onto the internet and you don't have EduRoam, those are the login details. They will be at each venue, so get those down. There have also been some changes to the program since we let out the final one, and so in light of that, there are programs at each venue. So for instance, in this venue, which is Fine Arts Seminar Room, on the door, in the front of the door, you'll see the updated program. It's not very different, but it does have some changes. And then there is tea in the foyer in the English department, which you can feel free to have at any point. There will be Bushe, who I can't see now, will be taking everyone to the English department, if you don't know where that is, for the first session. There is also tea in the room next door to us, for those who are in this venue, and feel free to help yourselves to that. Okay, right. Okay, so here's to a good conference, and we hope that you all enjoy what we have lined up for you. And we're really hoping to create just a community of scholars and thinkers and artists and people who just want to talk about African feminisms. Please also note that we're having another conference next year, so keep that in mind. We'll be making announcements soon. Well, not soon, but you know. And now I'd like to hand over to our keynote speaker, Dr. Danai Muptosa, who is going to be talking about feminism as pedagogy. Dr. Muptosa is a feminist scholar, a writer, a mother, and a teacher. She currently works at the Department of African Literature at the University of Witwatersrand. She has a BSc Honours degree in Gender and Transformation from the University of Cape Town, an MSc in Gender Studies, also from the University of Cape Town, and she's currently working on several book manuscripts, which interrogates forms and relations of intimacy through lenses such as love and lack. And so, if you allow me, I would now like to hand over to Dr. Muptosa. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really grateful for the invitation to speak. Can you all hear me? Okay. To speak today, I want to say thank you to Kandor and Linda and Charlene for inviting me to speak. I submitted an abstract that offered to reflect on the classroom as a companion to reading Sarah Ahmed's recent book, Living a Feminist Life. In that book, she borrows from Donna Haraway's formulation, companion species, which Haraway offers through a manifesto. A manifesto she offers as a personal document, a scholarly foray into too many half-known territories, a political act of hope in a world on the edge of global war, and a work permanently in progress in principle. For Ahmed, a companion text can be thought of as a text whose company enables you to proceed in a path less trodden, sparks a moment of revelation in the midst of an overwhelming proximity. They might share a feeling or give you resources to make sense of something that has been beyond your grasp. Companion texts can prompt you to hesitate or question the direction in which you are going, or they might give you a sense that you are going the way you are going, or in going the way you are going, you are not alone. My first memories of the classroom are not good ones necessarily, at least not the ones most crisp in my mind. I was always afraid of getting into trouble or getting something wrong. I've almost always feared to speak up. I never spoke once in my English literature classes in high school. At home, I imagined I could, so I would anticipate the teacher's questions and practice my answers in the mirror several times. The more that my arm was the heaviest part of my body. I never raised my arm. The words sometimes slipped out in mumbled whispers, and I would quickly gather them back into my throat. We lived in Botswana for many years of my childhood. Many, childhood is short, so relative to my childhood it was many. It was not that many. We moved back to Harare when I was in grade 6. After just a few weeks in the new school, Mrs. Dudia asked to speak to me. She told me that she would promote me to her class, which was the first stream, because my English was so good. I thought it was odd to assess someone's intellect through that way, but I was pleased nonetheless. So I was promoted. I arrived to her class the next day when she asked me to sit at a desk next to this boy, who she described to me and the class as the most disruptive boy in the class. She hoped that he would be influenced by my quiet and my calm. I sat next to this boy who tried to talk and joke and laugh with me throughout the rest of that year. I sat stiffly, hoping that he would not get me into trouble. One morning after the school holidays, I reported to Mrs. Dudia that I had forgotten my library book at home. My father was still living in Botswana that year. The book was there. I told her that he would bring it in 2 weeks when he visited. Her eyes were sharp with anger. I was standing at the front of the class, speaking very, very softly to her ear, which was terrifying enough. She asked me to speak up, Tell the stories to the others, she told them, that I must be very spoiled. She then turned my body to face the class, then lifted my dress and smacked me one single time in the middle of my thighs. And the class half laughed and half hissed, "Aish." Punishments done with an audience demand an orally sensational reception. The smack in the middle of the thighs, where the skin is so soft, was surely painful enough. But the lesson was not simply painful correction of the spoiled, forgetful child. I have never stopped forgetting to return my library books in that time, or since it at least. I feel tremendous shame at forgetting to return my library books since that time. But it would still be the classroom where I learned new tongues to describe the things I always sensed were wrong. Like books and poems, it was also teachers who were my companions. These were teachers that affirmed my sense that there was something wrong with the classroom. These were teachers that also filled me with a sense of the classroom as an objective of defamiliarization. In a recent article, Peace Kigwa reflects on her classroom practice through a reading of Bell Hooks' propositions for an engaged pedagogy. Kigwa notes that in the terrain of teaching and learning, the role of affect has received recent attention, in recognition that moments of encounter in the classroom are not only socio-cognitive in nature, but may also be affective and emotive for the student and teacher. The various classrooms I have sat in open already from that set of premises, where, for instance, the situation of the classroom is understood to open from the premise of the personal as political, where the politics of location was defined as a theoretical, ethical, genealogical, and pedagogical orientation. These classrooms drew my attention to how a learned and practiced separation of body and mind was in the questions of whose ways of knowing we understood to carry authority and whose we learned were marginal. These classrooms were my companions in the ways they brought me to proximity, to my accumulated experience and my sense of justice. I imagine that, like many other Black women, I remain invested in questions of what it means to know something, to epistemological and methodological questions. It was no surprise to me then that when I had a chance to develop a postgraduate course, it would rest on this set of investments. Proposed a course with the title Sentiment, Sensation, and Feeling at the end of 2015. The course was broadly interested in questions of affect, which, like a range of theoretical terms in the knowledge market, is received or receiving the sorts of attention, or certain sorts of attention in the present that press present scholarly debates about thinking and feeling. The course description read as follows, or continues to read as follows: many recent debates about the form, narrative, and genres of literary and cultural production emphasize an interest in intimacy. This course offers an important set of related interventions concerning intimacy and its connections with political, ethical, and theoretical relations to knowledge, ontology, difference, and representation. The course examines the role of feeling, sentiment, and sensation through literary and cultural productions that instigate affective publics. The course is interdisciplinary in aim, considering how literary and philosophical texts, along with a range of writing on affect, history, psychoanalysis, feminism, queer studies, critical race theory, memory studies, and cultural studies. Of interest are theories that connect individual affective experience, the social, structural, and historical. Our topics consider the uses of sentiment, nostalgia, and the senses, popular culture and feeling, intimacy and distance, and racial melancholy, aesthetics, visuality, the body and objects. In this course, emotions are understood as a source of knowing. Students will be introduced to phenomenology as a methodology. We examine the ways that sovereign bodies, like the state, are constituted and organized through the politics of sexuality, race, gender and class, difference, and how bodies, objects, and space get marked through such processes. Students are also introduced to key concepts on space and time. Through our readings, we raise questions about subjectivity, performativity, agency, corporeality, and identity. Through these explorations of various genres in fiction, performance, ethnography, memoir, and film, we examine how social practices enable and produce sensual and sensuous subject positions. Corporeal practices are understood to be mediated by the visceral, affective, sentimental nature. There are many intellectual traditions that take on thinking and feeling, and feminist ones have perhaps been long interested because of the ways that emotion is over-determinedly associated with femininity. For Siangai, the association between emotion and women leads to the association with women's feelings, imagined always easily prone to turning ugly. Ngai has an interest in the feelings we think of as passionless or non-cathartic, like irritation. There are other feelings that have caught our attention because of the ways that they help us to notice that our sense of what is wrong is something that we share with others. Non-cathartic ones like shame. We notice is shared by others, which helps us to sense that while we have felt that we were wrong, something else is wrong. This has been the way of connecting thinking and feeling as consciousness for feminist work in various locations. The course carried another retention, or maybe the word should be intention. It was a love letter to smart girls. Smart girls who found companions in theory, big and small, whose practices and criticism offered the language to try to explain the world and what was wrong, who recognized the tendencies of racist patriarchal knowledges to separate the object of knowledge from the subject of knowledge, who paged through the works of this theory for tongues and mastery, tools to exit the status of the object, to rest in the status of the object, to learn these tongues so through an affect polarity Sylvan Tompkins has described as shame interest connected, where the pulsations of the thesis around shame, or all things, are what either enable or disenable so basic a function as the ability to be interested in the world. This was going to be a course into the quest of thinking feeling, or smartness that hurts, of thinking theory in tongues. Even as I speak it, the sentence leaks from my mouth and it tries to gather as it pours to a straight line, solidly meaningful. In that breath, it is a word laid over and over, like 5 words could escape from my lips all at once beside each other. Some words leap higher than others, marking their ambitious intention. A cloud fills my stomach and covers my head, swelling, pressing my tongue against the roof of my mouth, a possession. The tongue is one of the first things that we learn to straighten out. The course was offered for the first time in 2017 at honors and master's level. The majority of the class was made up by black women, with the exception of 1 white woman and 1 black man. We met once a week, and our readings and discussions gathered around the following key terms: public sentiments, sex in public, experience, loss, conjugality, sentiment and sensation, and animacy. The week on loss had readings generally concerned with the university as a project. The way that I initially imagined it, or the direction of the loss, came to me during a workshop held in Germany on something that was being described as literary humanities in the context of the global south, where we were asked to respond to the crushing tide of demands for decolonization. I watched a colleague present a paper on where she feared the loss, a paper on how, or where, rather, she feared the loss of Shakespeare. This was a white Shakespeare, the white one intimately tied with empire's aspirations. It struck me that this loss she feared and anticipated was quite a strange thing to fear to lose. Imagine what it might be like to lose something like a wish. This white settler Shakespeare seemed a flimsy, no less violent, genocidal, but flimsy wish. What must it feel like to lose your wish? To open our discussion that week, I asked for a round of responses to the readings, a practice we generally did in this classroom, along with the request for the people around the table in that room to respond to the readings. I asked for the class to say something about their relationship to knowing something. What discipline or disciplines have you been trained in? What are the ways that you can show you know something? From the perspective of that or those disciplines, how do you gain authority about what you know? Do you feel like you can speak with authority about the things that you know? I turned to my left. A woman spoke first about being a student in the Department of Sociology. Something struck a chord. She spoke a few sentences and then there were tears. I know that the question about how and what we know something is a question that hurts. Yet I could not have anticipated what that class would be like. There were two people in this room, or there should have been, there might be, who tried to resist to cry, myself mostly. Person after person tried to gather their tongue and offer a reflection of their expectations of the classroom. Person after person choked on tongue, sentences pressing multiple in each breath, almost desperate. A cloud, a companion cloud, gathered above our heads. I was speaking to Zeta Matabeni about living a feminist life in March this year. I asked her what she thought of the book, and she smiled and said she was frustrated by it. Why on earth was Sarah Ahmed put us, or why would she put us through all of those other books? Genealogies of men and their philosophy, their tables where we have tried to gather, and then do this. Why not this first? Letty was responding to the strong theory and its forms of citation, which largely disappear in this book. For a definition of theory, I quickly first turn to Ray Chow, who writes or uses the term theory to mark the paradigm shift introduced by post-structuralism, whereby the study of language, literature, and cultural forms becomes irrevocably obligated to attend to the semiotic operations involved in the production of meanings. Meanings can no longer be assumed to be natural. Henceforth, meaning is a term that occurs in scare quotes. Chow offers the term referentiality to describe the characteristics of Western theory, to describe what happens to minority discourses when they enter the field of theory, where the conditions of that theory, or the conditions rather, where that theory emerged as an oppositional consciousness or politics or practice is placed at a temporal distance in order for it to become universal, in order for it to be theory. That is, for it to be universal, it must be distant. Brief Sedgwick theory, strong theory, makes the critical value, say in relation to social justice, in relation to what is simply produced as critique, writing, the powerfully ranging and reductive force of strong theory can make tautological arguments, or tautological thinking rather, hard to identify. Even as it makes it compelling and near inevitable, the result is that both writers and readers can damagingly misrecognize whether and where real conceptual work is getting done, and precisely what that work might be. Ahmed opens the chapter Willfulness and Feminist Subjectivity with the sentence, "A feminist history is affective. We pick up those feelings that are not supposed to be felt because they get in the way of an expectation of who we are and what life should be." Feminist subjectivity here is diagnosed as a failed subjectivity, a sequence of immature will, a will that has yet to be disciplined, to be straightened out. In her previous book, Willful Subjects, Ahmed followed the figure of the willful girl through the grim fairy tale of the willful child. She revisits this girl, and the story goes. Once upon a time, there was a child who was willful and who would not do as her mother wished. For this reason, God had no pleasure in her and let her become ill, and no doctor could do her any good. And in a short time, she lay in her deathbed. When she had been lowered into her grave, and the earth was spread over her, all at once her arm came out again and stretched upwards. And when they had put it in and spread fresh earth over it, it was to no purpose, for the arm always came out again. Then the mother herself was obliged to go to the grave and strike the arm with a rod. And when she had done that, it was drawn in, and then at last the child had rest beneath the ground. The willful child has a story to tell, Muhammad tells us. We do not know what in the story, what it was the child was not willing to do. Disobedience is not given content because disobedience as such becomes a fault. The child must do whatever her mother wishes. If she is not willing, whatever. Willfulness is a judgment here, crucial to a disciplinary apparatus, and as a disciplinary apparatus, it is both care and discipline at the same time. The rod straightens out the willful child. As she gives up her will, becomes willing to obey, she is allowed to rest. Later in the chapter, Ahmed reminds us that education was, or is, one of the crucial technologies of colonial rule. The grim story of the willful child could also be then understood as circulating throughout the empire. Thinking about this willful child, this willful girl, helps me to think beside another recent preoccupation of mine, the story of the willful girl, Elelwani. In Chaveni Wadururi's film, Elelwani juxtaposes the rebellious Elelwani against another version of herself in a final posture as the queen of the entire land, fulfilling a destiny that is alternative to the vision of freedom and progress she initially aspired towards through education, one she could have never imagined. The film is an adaptation of Titus Maumela's book, first published in 1954 by the same name, which was the first ever written in Chilenda. It presents a story that emphasizes the value of education for girls and women in some of the ways that it is most authoritatively recalled or remembered by scholars. Co-producer of the film, Jyoti Maestri, offers her views on this film as an act of translation. She begins in framing Venda as a rich cultural landscape and community formed by long tradition of royal lineage and a vibrant history woven with incredible legends of sacred forests and lakes. Being in that community mediated her understanding and interpretation of the original novel. She also speaks of thinking about the film not only as a translation, but as a representation of or for Venda. The director of the film speaks in a similar way. While Uruli had read the novel as set work at school, when Maumela wrote the novel, he explained his motivations to write stories as one that was necessary because, as a teacher, the only book he could teach written in Chivenda was the Bible. The novel therefore acts to bring the Venda language, but also a set of life world into language and representation. Maestri relates one of the leading questions of their translation as, what relevance would such a story have in a democratic South Africa? And how would a young girl or woman expressing her wish for freedom be shown differently, if differently at all, than in the 1950s in apartheid? Maumela was a mission-educated teacher, and his novel reflects the training of some of its preoccupation. For instance, mission literature was often didactic, with the intention of converting the performer, reader, or audience. For example, we can take the Marion Hill plays produced in the early 20th century as an example, of which Becky Peterson argues were plays that were important because they are the earliest modern examples of the discursive deployment of theatre among Africans in South Africa. Peterson identifies 3 challenges posed by this work: to spread the gospel, address the social and political turmoil of the time, and to register African responses to Christianity, colonialism, and capitalism. These plays were produced at the Marion Hill Mission and would be central to training, among other things. Maumela wrote Elelwani first, and the novel carries all 3 challenges in content, narrative, and style, and tone. More specifically, thinking about the place of women in relation to the 3 challenges remains a preoccupation of his general corpus of work. For example, in 1957, he would write a play called Chililo, again concerned with customary marriage. In Maumela's work, we see the drama unfold between relations between adults and children, who highlight a tension between the past and the present, and the crisis of how young people are oppressed is played out in a binary between Christianity and tradition or custom. This conflict is one we can intricately relate through Dina Ligaga's analysis of the discourse of the good time girl. Ligaga offers the figure of the good time girl as occupying a contradictory position in contemporary public imaginaries as young, educated, beautiful, and fun-loving. This figure is one associated with sexuality, and more specifically the idea that sexuality is something that one possesses. It is the property of the person, rather than, say, a relation to others or community. This question of possession of the self, or one's sexuality, tied to how the good time girl is imagined to have a specific relation to consumption, is rather. The good time girl shares a genealogical relation with other figures of the modern girl, who we can observe in pages of the Black press from the early 20th century. The action of the film is organized in such a way around Eledwani's return to Venda after completing her undergraduate degree. She's been offered a full scholarship for postgraduate studies in the United States. She also arrives with her boyfriend Vele, who's proposed to marry her. And these ambitions are interrupted because emissaries, which I generally refer to as Uncle Daddies, have been sent to her father's house. The king wishes to marry her. She refuses initially, so the uncles stay until she can be convinced to honor this obligation. Uncle Daddies are the people that generally negotiate marriages, and in the film, these uncles are both often filmed at a very low angle. As such, the viewers are often placed in close proximity with these uncles, occasionally direct, face-to-face, placed in the position of the protagonist as she looks up directly at them. Eledwani refuses the marriage initially, so the uncles refuse to leave until she conceives. Maestri describes the intentions of making the film as being about balancing the democratic present with tradition, and offers the term governmentality as a method of explaining what she describes as a balancing act that our protagonist embodies. In a more recent article, Dina Ligaga offers a reading of the moral narrative, which she argues is mobilized to narrate stories, especially of women, in the public sphere. The moral narrative often circles around issues of gender and sexuality, playing out the struggle between good and evil, and offering us lessons in the end. Conflict and resolution are made highly visible. As a genre, this moral narrative about femininities relies on what is shared and sensed. A set of conventions, familiarities, expectations. The bodies of women and the sexual meanings attached to them are a marked feature of university life. Bibi Bakara Yusuf reads this connection, noting women's bodies at university campuses are a dense site for politics because of the prior assumptions about what it means to know something. We can read Bakara Yusuf alongside Zetu Matabeni's reflections on what it means for Black women to inhabit university spaces. She writes, "Countless women will tell you of the everyday pain they carry as they walk around campus, dodging men's sexual advances or even attempts to take over their bodies without consent. Routinely, they are reminded that certain spaces do not belong to women, that their bodies or body parts do not belong to them, and that the university is a heteropatriarchal male space. Its aggressive masculinity colludes with its suffocating whiteness. For many women, speaking out is not an option. It is a must, even with their voices choking. Escaping what everyone loosely terms rape culture becomes sheer luck. Rape as culture is made so palatable that it is even stripped of its gruesome harm and violence. Wounded bodies move around campus, watching their backs, minimizing their risks of injury, and attending classes with their male perpetrators." Matabeni, like Ligaga and Bakara Yusuf, draw our attention to the relationship between thinking, feeling, knowing, and body politics. They draw our attention to the connections between body politics and the university. The university as a post-colonial project of new men for new men cannot be seen as a static gender-neutral spaces to which women have been granted or benignly added. Teresa Barnes points to the inheritance of the African university. These inheritances, that carry. Right, I'll start again. Barnes points to the inheritances the African university carries that should be at the center of our discussions of decolonization. And I quote, "The identification of men and masculinity with the labor of the mind and women with the body was also transmitted to Africa, along with senates, vice-chancellors, the graduation robe, the funny hats, and the rituals of examination. To Africa was transmitted the idea that learning is a combative and aggressive process, that the worthy candidate is one who survives attackers and bests his foes, and that the experience of intellectual combat is intrinsic to intellectual life and production." For the final examination of the course, I asked students in the class to propose a project as response to an early chapter in Ahmed's book, Feminism is Sensational. In this chapter, Ahmed writes that feminism is sensational. When something is sensational, it provokes excitement and interest. Feminism often begins with intensity. You are aroused by what you come up against. You register the sharpness of an impression. Something can be sharp within it being clear without it necessarily being clear what the point is. Over time, with experience, you sense that something is wrong, or you have a feeling of being wronged. You sense injustice. Here I'm thinking, or guided by the idea then of feminist pedagogy is that which sits in that sense of arousal. Students were asked to choose companion texts, which could also be experiences that they have gathered, that are accumulated over time. So I want to conclude this talk today with a section of one student's response. She settled on what her body knew, that her mind could not settle. The student was at the university currently known as Rhodes, and was sexually assaulted, had a mediation with the perpetrator, and wanted to open a disciplinary case against the perpetrator after the process, currently known as Are You Referenceless? Hashtag. And she writes, "Settling the matter, to me, was like smoothing over the matter. Describing the role of the feminist killjoy, Ahmed writes, smoothing things over often means eliminating the signs of injury to create fantasy of the whole. Smoothing things over often means eliminating those who are reminders of an injury. In a similar way, the rule in the university disciplinary code smooths over the student's grievance. In the university's knowledge system, the student wants to make the violation reappear, weighs less than a rule which states that access to a particular process of seeking justice dissolves her right to do so. The claim that the matter is settled means that there is no recorded injury. Such a claim is consistently contradicted, contested by her body. In regards to other students, other cases, in taking the decisions not to prosecute, the university's proctors privilege the legal-based knowledge system over other forms of knowing. In effect, this renders the evidence of any complainant's pain, insufficient. Not having sufficient evidence means that, in the view of the university, no violation has occurred. Broadly, in addition to situations where a lack of evidence renders experience invalid, there are instances wherein evidence exists, but said evidence is used to delegitimize the victim's experience. So I'm concluding here with my co-companion. You cannot make love to concrete if you care about being non-essential, wrong or wanting. If you fear ever becoming diamonds or lard, you cannot make love to concrete. You cannot pretend concrete needs your loving. Thank you.
That was thoroughly illuminating. We're going to take a few minutes now to field some questions. So, those who have questions, anyone, just put up your hand. Or comments. Yes, Charlene?
Just when you said how many of us have found ourselves in literature and found our friends in literature and smart girls who go through creative kind of enterprises to find friends, it kind of really broke my heart in a good way. Because so often, the arts are dismissed for the abstraction or for the fact that, they're not sociological kind of enterprises. And yet, those are the spaces in which, creative fiction and visual arts and music and poetry, that many of us have found predecessors speaking about our pains and then realized, oh my God, it's not just me. And I'm not the weird one, but that there are other people that are going through this. And so I thought that was such a poignant moment when you mentioned that. It's such a simple statement, and yet it's really so profound at the power of literature and the power of the arts in helping us not feel lonely.
Thank you, Shari. There'll be more questions. Okay, let me just have a look. Betty.
A comment. Thank you so much. I like, among other things, the way you situated it in memory and personal memory. And I think that's something we could explore more. We talk a lot about, and we do a lot of memory work in different spheres, but memory in schooling and education, and the way in which that speaks to our present time, the way the past speaks to our present time. It certainly offers so many possibilities. And I think of someone like Mpashlele, who was doing this a long time ago, telling the apartheid story through memory of schooling and how we could do that of the past but also of the present. And I think that we should explore that. And it's a very feminist project as well.
Thank you, Benjamin. Yes.
Thank you very much for that welcome speech. I just want to add a comment to it. I picked up something very interesting. She said, sexuality is the property of the person. Now, I want to say to us here that it shouldn't, whatever we're doing here should not end here. Be in control, be in charge. After this colloquium, for us as female scholars, what next? Is it all about attending, writing, publishing, going back to our offices, sit down? There is a fight, and then we need to brace it all. Every one of us, starting from where we are. You don't have to be violent. You must be very tactical, very influential, map out very good strategies. Do not keep quiet, because it might be this person today. Somehow, if you don't speak now, certainly it's going to continue. So let's not just end this whole thing here, after now. What next? Sexuality, I'm going to be talking about. So I was very impressed. It's great. What are you doing about it? We have been writing. I mean, I woke up as a child writing and fighting. What are female scholars doing? So after now, what next? Thank you very much.
Do you want to come? Okay. Shall we take a few, Dina?
Thank you, Danai. As usual, you give us a lot to think about. So I don't know if, actually I think it's a comment. straw. You decide what to do with it. One of the points that I'm taking out of your talk today is the way in which you theorize the idea of interruption. So you gave the example of Helelwani and the uncle daddies who interrupt her dream to proceed with, she has a plan. She wants to go to the States on her scholarship with a new person. But they interrupt that dream. In other words, there is a way in which patriarchy tradition comes in to organize her life and straighten her out. And eventually she's, I imagine, forced to go with their plan eventually. But you also then speak at the end about the student who gives an account of her sexual harassment, sexual assault, yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. And what you then again draw attention to is the idea of interruption and what social media as one of the avenues for creating that interruption, in which case then interruption takes another form. So I think for me what's most interesting is the way in which you theorize this idea of interruption, and I'm actually quite interested here and in other talks to hear what people then get to say about ways in which society is interrupted and the kind of smoothness of patriarchy and all those kinds of traditional cultures are interrupted. So yeah, social media is of course top of my list because it's my thank you.
Thank you for your talk. When you talk about African feminism and our experiences of sexuality, gender, or race, they relate mostly to the affect or to the feelings and sensation. And we were talking about how we then talk about that in an academic theoretical space. We're talking about referentiality and the distance that there is. So I wanted to ask you, being a teacher as well, your experience of discussing that in an institutional and theoretical space, because as is very loaded with feelings and effect, I'm just thinking about that, something that also interested me in terms of how you are experiencing that. Yeah.
Linda, just to follow up on that, because with this, I just wanted to know about this new course, what your feelings are about the course, what the student, I kind of figure out what are the students' feelings are and what you think about going forward with the course. Because, like I said, and I told you about the it was one that's very effective.
Oh, yes, okay. 1 and 2.
Hi, I wanted to comment on Dr. Muptosa's presentation. It was really lovely, thank you. You said something about how kind of the university was exported into Africa and how its cultures were exported into Africa. And I kind of wanted to challenge that a little bit. So the feminist historian Paul Tiamlezeletsa notes that there are kind of 3 misconceptions about our universities, right? The first is the idea that universities were introduced by colonialism, which is just wrong. We have a history stretching back up to the Library of Alexandria, to Al-Azhar, to Timbuktu, both of which were established by women. The second is that there's a misconception that most universities were established under colonial law. With the exception of Algeria and South Africa, the vast majority of our continent's universities were established after colonial law. And the third misconception he notes is that the universities' institutions are European, but universities were introduced to Europe through the Moroccans and the Egyptians and so on, and much of their kind of corpus and bodies of knowledge and practices are kind of deeply informed by the Afro-Islamic world. So what I wanted to ask you is to think more carefully about how it is that, given the brevity of colonial institutions, universities on the continent, how is it that they come to saturate our a conceptualization of how a university works? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muptosa. I really enjoyed this, and I think that you captured a lot of great ideas together. I want to just to add on as a comment about companion texts. I think a lot of people forget the importance of reading literature alongside with critical thinking. And I'd like to point here, for example, Julia Kristeva, very well known for semiotics and psychoanalytic theory, but she's also a very serious novelist. She's published a lot of novels. So she also engages the text in terms of as a writer, and also she uses it in her examples when she's writing about the psychoanalytic theories. But also we have Simone de Beauvoir, who is also a very serious novelist. She won the equivalent of the Nobel Prize, Le Prix Goncourt, for some of her novels. A lot of people don't even know that about her, despite the fact that she was a great philosopher. I think that we need to look at education in a very holistic way. And these two thinkers that I just mentioned, Kristeva and de Beauvoir, there's something special and exciting about the way they think, and they mix the two. And I have the feeling that you are using those strategies in your teaching methods, and I would like to commend you.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Oh, yes. One more.
Yeah, I mean, it's not really, it's also not a question per se, but I just sort of like you to speak more. Firstly, thank you. If you could, you sort of mentioned this idea of the body as a site of memory. So if you could just sort of like speak to that, especially when we're living in these times where words are famous. Words fail us in many ways, and I think you're doing like incredible work in terms of theorizing around some of these aspects, but like I'm interested in this idea of other sites of knowledge, and specifically the body as a site of knowledge, and the body as a place of memory construction, and the body as an archive.
Thank you. And we'll take just one more question.
Thank you so much, it was lovely. I just started reading Sarah Ahmed's text on the plane yesterday and was crying, because of that kind of recognition. But what I wanted to ask was, this is a new course, and I think when we try and instantiate feminist pedagogies, it's always emergent in some ways. So I'd like to know what you would change.
I have one final one. Sorry. Obviously you brought up quite a lot of things which are quite pertinent to, our lived experiences within institutions, and one that stood out for me was the idea of disruption, right? As Dina was saying, and the practical implications of that, because if universities, are created around certain systems which keep certain people and certain bodies in power, let's talk about it, name it what it is. There is also the problem of the fact that institutions will punish dissent. And how do you navigate that within a system that will spit out the disruption? Okay, thank you.
Okay. Thank you. It was like a poem in the middle, so to do this. Okay. So I think one of my ongoing intuitions, and I think the kind of interruptions, even as I always speak, I'm always feeling like I'm interrupting myself, and I think that's a general guiding intuition that I have about any process of making. So, for example, the question about Zeleza, I think I disagree with you in the sense I'm with Zeleza, but I think that post-colonial for me is not a linear temporality of the present. I think it's the question about, are we dominated by forms of knowing that separate object and subject, which is the question of how we think of narratives. So there are many genealogies, intellectual, political, ethical, that live in these buildings, but also in other forms of spaces that prioritize different forms of knowing. And yet what we think of as thinking, when you ask me to think better or think with, prioritize the very action of being able to place the object in relation to a subject who can speak. And so I hold that intuition as a particular way of knowing, a particularly secular way of knowing, that is suited to how we think of the university in the present and enables the very practice around which knowledge becomes capital for exchange in the present. And so for me, the context of the post-colonial is not a pre and a post and a historical time that can be narrated as an object, but as a sense or an intuition of what delegitimizes other forms of intuition about knowing and a question of justice. And that's why I go with Teresa Barnes rather than Zeleza in that moment, but I read with them as forms of interruption for each other. So there's I don't, generally my intuition is never to sit somewhere and be, again, this is Berlin's notion, smartness that hurts. It's there and then it doesn't ever settle, because this is a continuing sort of processes that I think, as Charlene, as you said, that breaks the heart. How do we think in those ways? And how do we think of for me, I think what I was thinking is why am I attached to teaching as a vocation if it's been such a heartbreaking place for so long, and what do I think will happen there? Like, so people leave and then they get a degree and then they participate in the market, and how do you, and what is the responsibility of trying to make a classroom that is heartbreaking for someone who wants to go and have a job and have a way to live, to make live, right? If education is something we understand, is something that a person acquires as an object and enables their ability to make live, right? What is the purpose of it? So I think retaining that space, and for me it's a space of dense optimism. It's not nihilistic, but it's an ongoing kind of reflection. I like your comment about memory, and for me, thinking memory as a non-linear practice in the ways you're talking about, and also, and memory, particularly, again, we're talking about the questions of the disciplines. We can talk about how memory can give us a sense of what it means to, I can sit in this chair and remember that I can't sit like this anymore, and on the ground with my knees like this. My body's getting a bit different. But the things that I'm able to do with memory, and to think and to trust intuition as a way of knowing something, that are confronted. I mean, I can speak in this room as though it is some degree of authority, but for the most part, we're speaking in university context, but this is not a way to think authoritatively. Where in dominant disciplines of history, memory is not reliable. And the idea that something is not reliable means it is not legitimate. Even when the tools of that discipline themselves fail to, even on their own terms, right? So I think it's important to think through and retain that sense of, that's something you can't grasp. That's something that you can't make transparent. We're also taught that to know something is to be able to make it transparent, right? To be able to then give it to someone exactly the same every single time. And so opacity is dangerous in some sense. And so what are the ways that that can become, what are the ways to make space to retain that, so that, and for me, when I'm able to be opaque, as someone referred to me once at a conference, you're so opaque. And I was like, I don't want you to know what I'm saying, because I don't want you to know. So it's on purpose. I want you not to be able to understand me, because because I want to keep something. Or I'm addressing myself to someone who is going to recognize that, and then that form of recognition is something. So I think that's important. When the question on sexuality as a property of the person, it's something I speak in the breath and I pull at the same time, because of course just like to teach, but to be in relation to others is we don't own ourselves, right? So what is the way to live with the risk to want to claim the self as a possession, but to know that that's a way of thinking that precisely rests upon why it's easy to take someone else. And then to trust what it means to have a relation with another, and to trust that means a person doesn't own a person, or a person doesn't own themselves, or to disrupt that and happen in the same place. I think that to be tactical, strategic, to not keep quiet. I mean, for me, being in the classroom is not the only thing I do, but I think that it's part of the same questions of what it means to think about feminist activism. The people that I name as my companions are all people who taught me, to be an academic. In fact, they didn't want me to be not that I didn't want to, they didn't train me to be an academic. They trained me to do other things. And it's a coincidence, it's my own, I don't know why, I don't know why I want to be here. I don't know why I want to be here. I'm still trying to figure it out. I think the teachers who were my companions didn't necessarily imagine the academy as the space around which my work would be primarily located. Dina, interruption. There's so many interruptions. And I like how you name it as the interrupt her dream, and the different kinds of avenues of interruption. And the kind of interruption in terms of not being able to give an account of one's own assault. I'm going to come back to you because I can't read my handwriting. Institutional setting and how to think with the theoretical. So people in the course will tell you that it was a very densely theoretical course. Maybe it's actually, I think this assumption that the affective is not theoretical is false. It's very demanding to think about. To think the ways that I'm thinking about is very demanding, because you have to think. Some weeks we're reading things out of physics and biology. Some weeks we're reading things out of poetry. Some weeks we're reading things out of geography. It's a very demanding theoretical exercise, and the assumption then that it's a retreat from other institutional theoretical knowledge sites is false, because I guess this thing on speaking tongues, you having to speak many disciplines at once to try and you don't know where your enemy is at, so you're trying to understand all of them at once. And so it's really hard work. It's like to have eyes everywhere, and then also to know that, so this is even the antagonism with strong theory, which separates object-subject, which it develops one's expertise by being so opaque that no one even knows where you're going, right? But I don't think it's an anxiety that must go away. So how to speak many languages, and to I think it's an ambitious anxiety, but I think it's part of what it means for that object or objective. Linda, since you are the external examiner, I wait for your comments. What are my feelings? Like I said, I think it was quite theoretically rich, quite dense. It was overwhelming for me to examine the final projects because it was so broad. Someone made a bag. 2 people wrote essays. Someone performed a piece. There were 2 films made. It was I didn't know how to write a report. I didn't know what to do. And now I'm like, oh, next year will be easier because it's all designed now. But I think the room, but I doubt that will be the case. I think I learned so much from the set of conversations that I can't imagine what next year is like. I think it's okay for it to be once a year. I think I need time to answer your question. I think I said something about, what I don't say in this is, for me, is thinking about the role of the teacher as sacred. For me, is about thinking about the role of how we are made to think in a secular way. That to be a part of this, part of what rips the poetic, the erotic out of knowing is precisely the how secular these spaces are. But it's a kind of weird secularity because it's not that secular. And so I'm still working through that. And I think it's related to how we think of the body as a particular site of memory. And I think the body does fail, but I think that's okay. Because for me, it's not about an essentializing closed location of the body. But it's how do we, so if one begins and say, how do I trust when my tummy does this as a methodological or an epistemological orientation? I don't think there's one way of moving from that place of how do we think of how the body speaks, and then how to not split the body from spirit, mind. These are all kind of ongoing questions that I think, at least in the course, everyone took in very different kinds of directions, and I think that's productive. I think that's everything. Companion texts, I'm very much with you. It could be so many. It could be, I'm done actually. There could be so many companions. It could be so many people, voices in my head. So I think de Beauvoir for sure, and you said Irigaray? Kristeva, of course, yeah. So I mean, the range. Part of me is also like, how do we think the question of African feminisms plural, and try to practice forms of citation that, for me, the citations are not geographically like them. This one is this one is this one, but how do I make dense connections between and to situate? So it's not to make various kinds of geographic citations and their various forms of power and where they get to exist. To also means for me that sometimes situating a discussion where it comes from. So for example, when I say politics of location, that conversation comes out of lesbian feminism, so I situate it there for a purpose, for that not to go away. Which is not to say that it mustn't move between other geographies or other intentionalities, even as it emerges as a way for someone to explain why politically what they're doing when they've never read a feminist text in their life is the same. So how to put those things in the same place without about saying, now I give you both authority, but precisely with the intention of rupturing what authority might connote.
Thank you very much. I think we're all ready to give you a round of applause.
My shyness.